So as we all know, Rabbi Hirsch is fairly famous. I'd say pretty famous. He's the honorary life president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, an honorary life member of the boards of the Jewish Agency for Israel and the World Zionist Organization, and founding director of the American Reform Movement for Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. He was he was ordained at the Hebrew Union College, and he's really just an incredibly special person. So without further ado, Rabbi Hirsch.
I saw it was Martin Luther King Day, and since it was my privilege to be a close friend and co-worker of Martin Luther King, we decided that it would be appropriate to pass out this eulogy, which I unfortunately, tragically, had to deliver a couple days after he was assassinated. Martin Luther King was a great man, and as I said, it was my privilege to work with him on a close basis. In fact, this institution which I established, to which Felice just referred, was his home in Washington. When I first met him, which was early in 1962, I found out that he had very little money, and he didn't have an office in Washington. So I said, anytime you need an office, I had a 4-story building, anytime you need an office, we'll give you one. And he would come in very frequently, and we became good friends. Speaking of Israel, not only did he make a singular contribution to American democracy, but he was also an ardent Zionist. And I had a number of conversations with him, as well as his public utterances, a number of conversations with him when it was clear that he was an ardent Zionist. And he was such an ardent Zionist that when people talked about anti-Zionism, he says, that isn't anti-Zionism, that's anti-Semitism. I had put into my office, we had a 4-story building, the National Conference on Civil Rights. And that was an umbrella group of all of the major national organizations, the religious groups, all of the African American groups, the labor groups, everyone who was concerned with the passage of legislation. And we had a beautiful conference room in my center. And you should be very proud of the fact that all of the deliberations which took place on the civil rights legislation of the 1960s were held in our offices in a Jewish building. And without the Jewish organizations, I can tell you now, that civil rights legislation wouldn't have passed, because it was the Jewish groups that had the expertise and did the lobbying, without which the civil rights legislation would not have passed. So we should all be very proud, and we should remember that as we observe today Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I also want to pay tribute to the Federation of South Palm Beach County, this federation. Felice had mentioned that I had the privilege, and I have the privilege still, of being a life member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency. And in that capacity, I know quite a bit about the federations in America. And I think this federation is tops. I don't know who it was who had the vision to acquire 100 acres here and to put on these grounds, to put community centers and welfare agencies, and this also to schools, very important schools, and to put this center for us senior citizens to live on. I've experienced the privilege of seeing how the Federation here functions. And I think there are two very distinct characteristics which they have. One is the belief that it's important to have unity without uniformity. Unity without uniformity. And the second characteristic, which to me is very important, is there's a real love of Israel in this community. And I'm very proud of that. We have a phrase in Jewish tradition, Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. Every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. And I would hope that in tribute to this federation, everyone here would become an active member and a donor of the federation. Well, now to talk about the subject which Felice asked me to talk about, the relationship between American Jewry and Israel. I had an experience many years ago. I was in a taxi from Manhattan to JFK Airport, and I looked up at the medallion, and I saw the name of the driver was Motke Goldstein. And he talked with a heavy Yiddish accent. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going back home to Israel." He said, "You live in Israel?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Israel's my whole life. All I do is think and dream about Israel. My whole family lives there." I said, "Listen, the way you're talking, why don't you come back with me? Come and live there." He said, "What? Me live in Israel? Never." I said, "What's wrong?" He says, "There's corruption. There's hypocrisy. There's a lack of idealism." I said, "But don't we have those shortcomings in America?" He said, "Yeah, but here it doesn't bother me. There it would kill me." I think that's an interesting comment on what some Jews have in terms of the relationship between Israel and American Jewry. In his own way, Motke really demonstrated a profound insight into Israel diaspora relations. Because, you know, there are some Jews who understand that Israel is a special place for the fulfillment of Jewish aspirations. And when Israel does not attain the high standards which they would like Israel to attain, then somehow or other they distance themselves from Israel. That's one relationship between American Jews and Israel. But there's another much more serious relationship, and that's the relationship that most of the scholars have in terms of American-Israel relationships. And they called it the metaphor of Babylon, Jerusalem. Babylon, you remember, in the year 586 BCE, Babylonia conquered Palestine and took the Jews off into exile. And those Jews who were in Babylonian exile had a remarkable existence because they became very wealthy and they became learned, and much more so than the community that was left in Palestine. And if you want to compare it, you can see, if you look at the Talmud, for example, there are two Talmuds. There's a Babylonian Talmud and there's a Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is 20 huge volumes, takes up this much space in a library. The Jerusalem Talmud is one volume. The Babylonian community was much wealthier, and the Babylonian community supported the Palestinian community. So when American scholars began to talk in the early days about the relationship between American Jewry and Israel, America was Babylon. We were the ones who were helping those schnooks in Israel. And that's what we did. So they looked upon Israel, and they used to say two foci. There are two equal foci in Jewish life. There's the focus of America and the focus of Israel. Well, in 1967, after the Six-Day War, I said, and I wrote articles and I gave lectures, and I said, I don't accept that definition. I don't accept the two foci plan. And I came up with another metaphor. And I said, Israel is Broadway, and the diaspora is off Broadway. Israel is the center stage of Jewish life, particularly now after the Six-Day War. And I caught hell for it. And many of my colleagues, both rabbis and scholars, criticized me. They say, you're deprecating the American Jewish community. I said, no, I'm not doing anything of the kind. All I'm saying is I'm looking at the reality. But in a way, they said they were right. Why? There were only, in 1967, there were only 2.5 million Jews living in Israel. And there were 5.5 million Jews living in America. But I want to tell you something. What I predicted in theory in 1967 has today become a demographic reality. The Jewish population of America is declining, unfortunately. Today, we consider the Jewish community, according to various demographers, the Jewish community in America, including the Jews, the many hundreds of thousands of Jews who came from the former Soviet Union, and the many Jews who came from Israel and other places of Jewish residents. Today, the American Jewish community is only 5.2 million. And you know what the population of Israel is today? 6.5 million. So Israel today is the largest Jewish community in the world. I have a friend who's a professor, probably the professor of demography in the Jewish world. His name is Sergio de la Pergola. He's a professor at the Hebrew University. And he predicts that by the middle of this century, 2050, the world Jewish population will be as follows. 57% Israel, 35% North America, including Canada, 8% the rest of the Jewish diaspora. To state it another way, when your grandchildren become grandparents, there is no guarantee that their grandchildren will be Jewish. Whereas in Israel, there is a guarantee, almost, maybe not 100%, you can also marry Arabs, but the probability that the grandchildren of your grandchildren will be Jews. Now, why is Israel the center stage? Why are we so concerned about what happens to Israel? Because we know instinctively that Jewish destiny will be shaped by what happens in and to Israel. That the well-being and creative survival of American Jewish community, and indeed of the entire Jewish people, will be dependent upon the well-being and creative survival of the state of Israel. But this evening, I not only want to talk to you about survival, I want to talk to you instead about the character of survival. How shall we survive? What shall be the nature of our survival? And in order to respond to that question, I think we have to return to Jewish history. You know that from biblical times up until the emancipation of the Jews at the end of the 18th century in Europe, we Jews were a separate people. Wherever we were, we lived separately. We were subject to persecution, to pogrom, to expulsion, prejudice. Wherever Jews lived, we were shuttled from country to country. We lived apart. And lived at the whim of people among whom we lived. But then along came the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And the French had Declaration of the Rights of Man. Voltaire, Rousseau, incidentally, they were anti-Semites. Voltaire and Rousseau. They were for freedom of man, but they were anti-Semites. And the French didn't know what to do with these Jews. Are you a church? Okay, if you're a church and you have different beliefs only, you're welcome. So you can be French citizens. If you're a nation, a separate nation, you're not entitled to French citizenship. And there was a man whose name was Clermont-Tonnerre, and he was the very active proponent of equality for Jews. He was a philo-Semite. He loved the Jews. And he said, famous statement, "To the Jews as a nation, nothing. To the Jews as individuals, everything." So poor Napoleon didn't know what the heck to do. So in the year 1806, you know what he did? He convened an assembly of Jewish notables. He took the leading Jews in France. Incidentally, most of them were Orthodox rabbis. It was long before, 25 to 50 years before there was a reform movement. And he said to these Jews in pure French, "No. No Jews. What are you? Are you a nation, a separate people, or you want to become French citizens? And the Jews, again, Orthodox Jews, began to dilute the ethnic dimensions of Judaism. So much so that some of them even converted to Christianity. They went whole hog. The son of Emmanuel Deutsch, who was the chief rabbi of France, converted to Christianity. And the son-in-law, who had studied for being a rabbi, in the middle of his studies, converted and became a Catholic priest. Now, it was a historical paradox. The more we Jews try to redefine Jewish identity, contract ourselves into a religion only, the more the outside world continue to define us as a people. And a people who are different, and therefore legitimate targets for discrimination and persecution. And we discovered that discrimination against the Jews was not directly related to theological belief, to Judaism as a religion. No, to the contrary. The world theoretically escaped. To create theoretically accepted the Judeo-Christian heritage. They talked about our common biblical values. You know, it's like the man who said, I love mankind. It's just people I can't stand. So the world said, we love the Judeo-Christian heritage, but we can't take the damn Jews. Hitler never cared about what the Jews believed. He threw the guy who had converted into Christianity into the concentration camp alongside the Orthodox Jew with Pez, because Hitler wanted to destroy the Jewish people. So at the end of the 19th century, along came this fellow, basically an assimilated Jew, Theodor Herzl. He was the correspondent for the Vienna Jewish Press in Paris, and he saw the Alfred Dreyfus trial. Alfred Dreyfus, who himself was an assimilated Jew, but he was a Jew by ethnicity, and he was accused of treason. And Herzl saw that rampant anti-Semitism in France. And so you know what he did? He sat down, this assimilated Jew, and in a frenzy of inspiration, he wrote The Jewish State. And he said, you know what? If the world still calls us a people, no matter how we try not to be a people, then let's us really become a people. And the way to become a people is to go back to the land of Palestine, and there to establish our sovereignty and our own government, and live like Jews culturally and spiritually. So the rest is history. Now, to the question of what has happened to American Jewry. In contrast to the French, we in America have established a great Jewish community, a really great Jewish community. We have institutions of learning, we have books, we have scholars, we have Jews who have studied, we have Jews who go to synagogue. It's a great Jewish community, and we've achieved miracles. But, my friends, I want to tell you what's happening as I see it to American Jewry. I'll give you my personal biography. I had two grandfathers. I guess we all had two grandfathers. One grandfather came from Hungary. One grandfather came from the Ukraine. When they came to Ellis Island and the immigration official met them, and my grandfathers were standing along Irish, Italians, French, German, other nationalities. And the official asked my grandfathers, what are you? Who are you? They didn't say Hungarian. They didn't say Ukrainian. They said Jew, because they were a Jew by nationality. But now, take a look at what's happening today in America. You ask their great-great-great-grandchildren, what are they? And if they say Jew, I can tell you right now, unfortunately, some of them would no longer say Jew in my family. But if they say Jew, they mean they're on a par with Protestant and Catholic, which is a religious identification. And that's the paradox. The paradox in American Jewish life today is that most American Jews identify not as a nationality, but as a people, but as a religion, not as a people, but as a religion, on a par with Protestants and Catholics. I'm told, is police still here?
I'm right here.
Okay, glad you didn't walk out yet. I'm told that in the Federation, this area of the Federation, there are approximately 130,000 Jews. Is that right?
That is correct.
And but only 12 to 15% of them belong to synagogues here. Incidentally, from what I hear, the synagogues here are great. I think we should all be very proud of the fact that I understand the synagogues here are better attended than any other place in the country almost. And there are wonderful rabbis here. And I, as a rabbi, I am proud of the fact that there are people who identify religiously as Jews. But in all fairness, if we contrast it with what Jewish life was like when Jews were a nationality, when we identify as a religion only, it represents a contraction of Jewish identity. So why does American Jewry need Israel? Because we Jews are a people, not a religion. We have a land. We have a culture. We have a language. The language used to be Yiddish for the Ashkenazic Jews, or Ladino for the Sephardic Jews. But today, the Jewish language is Hebrew. You know that when Hirsch wrote the Jewish state, you know what he thought the language would be? German. Because that was the language of culture and civilization. What a travesty. Today the language is Hebrew. Herzl thought it would be German, but there was a Meshuvah guy, his name was Eliezer ben Yehuda. Incidentally, he had 12 children with 2 wives, and he had a volume of a Hebrew dictionary for each child. 12 volumes of a Hebrew dictionary. Made up words. Most of the words were biblical, of course, but there were modern words that he put in. And Eliezer ben Yehuda was such a fanatic. He said, no, the language of this Jewish state has to be Hebrew. He was such a fanatic that the story is told that one day he passed by a woman who was in labor, and she was in pain, and she said, Mamachka, Mamachka, Mamachka. He said, Ishata Brit, woman, speak Hebrew. The best proof of how the state of Israel has re-injected the concept of peoplehood into Jewish life is the proof that you have given me. I've talked to many of you. You've told me with great pride how your children have gone to Israel on birthright, and how in only 10 days they've experienced an injection in Judaism, which in some cases lasts a lifetime. The prophet Ezekiel talked about the divine promise which has come true with the establishment of the state. The state of Israel gives body to the Jewish soul and breath to the Jewish spirit. And Ezekiel projected a divine promise which has come true with the establishment of the state. And I have put in you a new heart, and a new spirit will I put within you. Vishavtem ba'aretz asher natati la'avotechem, and you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. Well, that's why we in America need Israel. Now, why does Israel need American Jewry? Well, one thing we all know, Israel needs our economic support and our political support. Political support may be even more important than the economic support. Although economic support really amounts to political support, because the congressmen know the truth. People put their money where their mouth is. We used to talk about the fact that, I remember a discussion among Jews, fellow Jews in America, when we lived in America. We do now, unfortunately, we're here. But we used to talk about the fact that there's no Jewish vote. We used to argue, is there a Jewish vote? No, there's no Jewish vote. Jews vote all the way. But you talk to AIPAC. I know that Matt Levin used to work for the head of this federation. Professional head of the federation, used to work for AIPAC for many years. You talk to anybody in AIPAC and you ask them if there's a Jewish vote or not. When all those congressmen and senators rush to the AIPAC meetings, they'll tell you there's a Jewish vote. And the Jewish vote is dependent upon how you vote for issues relating to Israel. And if you don't vote for issues relating to Israel, you can forget about the Jewish vote. But Israel needs American Jewry on a much more profound basis than just the economic and political base. Israel, to be sure, is a democracy, but the electoral system in Israel is a pretty bad system. It goes back to the old Zionist system of the 19th and early 20th century. There are too many parties. And no party has ever had a majority. And there's no constituents. That's like in Great Britain, they have a parliamentary system also, but at least they have a constituency. So people vote in their own district, not in Israel. So since no party ever has a majority, what do? If a party wants to get 61 out of 120 seats in order to have a majority in the Knesset, what do? They have to merge with other parties in a coalition. And who's the easiest partner for a coalition? The religious parties. The religious parties are very easy to make a coalition with. What do you have to do? You got to promise them funds for their educational system, an independent educational system. You got to make sure that they have control over Shabbat observance, and you have to make sure that they are in control of marriage, divorce, and conversion. It's a pretty messy situation. And this has led to continuing battles over issues of religious pluralism. Because the Orthodox political parties, when religion becomes a political party, it destroys religion, not just the politics. But when there are Orthodox parties, it destroys the political system. So what did we do? I and my conservative and reform colleagues in the conservative and reform movement declared, again after the Six-Day War in 1967, that Israel is the center. If Israel is the center, then we have to be there. And we have to be there physically. Israel will not be home for all the Jews of the world if all the Jews in the world do not feel at home in Israel. And so I accepted the position as head of the World Reform Movement. And I did so on one condition, that we move our international offices from New York to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the heart of the Jewish people. And I accept the position on that condition. And I advocated, incidentally, that we merge the conservative and reform movements, because the average Jew in Israel thinks you're either Orthodox or nothing. And they can't delineate between conservative and reform Judaism. So eventually we have to merge. I proposed it, I've had all kinds of meetings about it. So far we haven't succeeded. But it's not enough for American Jews to send resolutions. We have to have resolute action in Israel. It's not enough to send a fax. You have to create facts in Israel. And that's what we've done. Between the two movements, we've established well over 100 congregations. We have schools of education, magnificent schools of education. We've ordained in the Reform movement last month, in November, we ordained the 100th rabbi. Many of them are women, incidentally. And we have the program of Women at the Wall, where we try to fight for equal rights. And we're fighting in the courts. And we built a magnificent World Center, and Felice referred to that. The theater, which is named after me, us, after Bella and me, is just one part of what Felice can tell you, and those of you who have been there, is a magnificent World Center for Progressive Judaism. And we've recognized that there's another major problem, which is even more serious than the lack of pluralism in Israel. And that's the growth today of ultra-Orthodoxy. It's a very serious problem. You know that when Ben-Gurion wanted to establish the government in 1948, he wanted to bring in the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox, who did not believe, and to this day do not believe, in the establishment of a Jewish state. You can't have a Jewish state until the Mashiach comes. And the Mashiach hasn't come yet. Who knows when he will come? But he hasn't come yet. We don't think he ever will come, but that's another story. And the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, is as distinct from the modern Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox, unfortunately, are growing by leaps and bounds. There were only 400 yeshiva students in 1948. So Ben-Gurion made a deal with them. He said, listen, you come on in and join us, help us establish the state. And we'll exempt those 400 yeshiva bochorim. They can sit and study. But that 400 today is now 60,000. And whereas only 10% of the population of Israel, only 10% are ultra-Orthodox, the percent of children entering first grade this year, 2017, the percent of ultra-Orthodox was 27%. Now you can project that, the present rate of tremendous high birth rate over the next 50 years, and there's a population projection which I received the other day, which says that over 40% of the population of Israel in 2065 will be ultra-Orthodox. That's a serious problem. An even more serious problem is the fact that they don't get an education, a secular education. They don't study mathematics or science or research, history, philosophy. They study the Talmud. And that's not enough to live as an equal citizen in an equal society. They become non-productive citizens and they become poor. The poverty rate among the ultra-Orthodox is overwhelming. So Israel needs American Aliyah and the influence of egalitarianism that we have in the pluralistic American Jewish community, and which is manifest here in this federation and community. Ever since President Trump gave his talk on Jerusalem, And ever since the UN took the action that it did, that very negative reaction concerning Jerusalem, we've been especially sensitive, we the Jews of America, to the meaning of Jerusalem in our lives. You know that Jerusalem is mentioned many hundreds of times in our Bible. I want to close my remarks by talking about the profound religious significance of Jerusalem for Jews. Our tradition speaks of two Jerusalems. There's Jerusalem Shel Mata, the earthly Jerusalem, the terrestrial Jerusalem, the Jerusalem as it is, and there's the Jerusalem Shel Mala, the heavenly Jerusalem, the celestial Jerusalem, the Jerusalem which is yet to come, which will be established on earth with the fulfillment of the Messianic vision. You know, there's an interesting phenomenon in Jewish life. Every ancient civilization, whether it be the Roman, the Greek, the Egyptian, the Chinese, every ancient civilization believes that the golden age was in the past. Judaism is the only civilization extant which believes that the golden age is yet to come. The Jerusalem, the physical place, is inseparable from Jerusalem, the spiritual ideal. We Jews have never lived for ourselves alone. The destiny of Am Yisrael is inseparable from the destiny of all humankind. We believe that Eretz Yisrael today, the state of Israel, is the conviction that the life of every nation is potential as well as existential. That's the aspiration of Judaism, which makes Jerusalem the center of the universe, and the Jewish people the pulsating heart of the Jewish family. Okay, you Did you say you want to have some questions for Elise?
Does anyone have questions?
If anybody has a question or a comment. Blanche. I'll repeat the question, honey. Does somebody want to take a mic around? Go ahead. What's the question? I'll repeat it.
Yes, I would like to hear about your experience being on the march in Selma to Montgomery.
Did you get a question?
Well, I had Blanche Meisel wanted to ask, what's my experience with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama? I was the first Jew down in Selma, Alabama, when there was the, if you remember, there was the incident where the blacks in Selma, Alabama tried to register to vote, and the sheriff, who was a racist, like somebody else we know, the sheriff, but then it was much worse, in all fairness. The sheriff didn't let him register, and some people were killed. And Martin Luther King issued a call to clergy. And the next morning, I received to come down and help and identify with the cause of voter registration. And actually, it's quite interesting. I received the call, and I had from the head of the National Council of Churches, he says, we have 13 Protestant clergy and a Catholic Monsignor. We've got 15 seats on a plane leaving at 1 o'clock. The call was at 6:30 in the morning. Leaving at 1 o'clock, can you get us a rabbi? I said, well, I can't go. I've got an important meeting at the White House on the civil rights issue. He said, well, find us a rabbi. We can't go without a rabbi. I said, I promise you a rabbi. I called my wife, Bella. I said, Bella, after I looked around, I must have called 4 or 5 people. It was quite dangerous, and we had 4 little kids at home. And I called Bella, and I said, Bella, I can't find a rabbi. Is it all right if I go? Because it was dangerous. And Bella said, I want you to go. And so the minister called me up, and he said, did you get me a rabbi? I said, yeah. He said, who? I said, me. And so I went, and I flew with a good friend who was the Methodist the Methodist Bishop of Greater Washington, a very famous clergyman, John Wesley Lord, and we were good friends. We flew together, and we came to the event, and Martin Luther King was already speaking. They put us up on the, put me up and a minister and a Catholic Monsignor on the pulpit, and Martin Luther King was speaking. And he finished speaking, and he said, Dick, you're next. And I wasn't prepared at all. I got up and I quoted, I gave what I think is the greatest talk I ever gave in my life. Excuse me for not comparing this talk. The greatest talk I think I gave, it lasted a half hour. Not one word was mine, and it was 3 sentences. How's that possible? I said, I thought I would take from Jewish tradition. When God created man, it created man, only one man. Why? Says Jewish tradition. So that no man would ever be able to say, my Father is greater than your Father. And if you've ever been in a black church, and I have been in many, I've spoken in many churches, it's not like a synagogue where nobody applauds. They don't even applaud the wonderful sermon the rabbi preaches. But hallelujah, brother! And they start shouting in the aisles and dancing in the aisles. You give it to him, Rabbi! And Martin Luther King quieted him down. And then he gave one other sentence. Then I did one other sentence. When God created man, he created him using dust from the 4 corners of the earth. Why? So that no one would ever be able to say, the place from which you come is better than the place from which I come. Hallelujah, brother! Yeah, the aisles, and give it to him, Rabbi! Give him hell, Rabbi! Martin Luther King quieted him down. And I did my last sentence. And when God created man, he created man using every color of dust. Why? So that no man would ever be able to say, the color of my skin is better than the color of your skin. Hallelujah, bro. Another 10 minutes, and I said a few concluding remarks and sat down. That evening, the interesting thing is, there was only one hotel in town, and the journalists had taken up, the journalists and television people had taken up the hotel, so they put us in a hovel, a one-room hovel of a black African-American washerwoman. And Bishop John Wesley Lord, who was my good friend and with whom we had the Methodist Bishop of Greater Washington, decided we would go sleep together in this woman's hovel. And we came there, and she had a double bed, and she put up linens on the floor. And we said, we'll sleep on the floor. She began to cry. She said, no, I want you to sleep in the bed. So Bishop John Wesley Lord and I spent the night in the bed. Now today, you might think something else. In those days, it was different. We got up in the morning, and outside the door, there were dozens and dozens of newspaper people and So they asked the bishop, Bishop Lord, how did you feel sleeping with a rabbi? He said, well, it was a very nice experience. And they asked me, I said, you know, I knew that sooner or later, I hoped at least, I aspired at least, that someday I would sleep with the Lord. Never in my wildest imagination did I ever believe I would sleep with a bishop. That was the story of that. Anyhow, it was only 11 days later, Blanche, that we went to the march on Washington from Selma to Montgomery, and I led the Jewish religious service. But it was a great experience, and of course it's gone down in history now as a major event, as has the March on Washington. Okay.
Excuse me.
Oh, you got something?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you. I think it's the best speech I've heard in this hall.
That's because she speaks Hebrew.
Yeah. Rabbi, I just would like to hear a few words from you about your activities in Russia in bringing the Jewish community from Soviet Union to Israel. I heard it from you, and it's and especially also the role of your wife, wonderful Bella.
Thank you very much. Well, I have to pay tribute to my wife. I had the good fortune of marrying a girl that I didn't know before we got married. We never had a date. But that's another story. I won't go into that. But I married this wonderful girl who was born in Russia, in Siberia, not where all of your parents came from, or my grandparents came from, but from Siberia, the border of Siberia, and came to Israel. Bella is a kind of a heroine. She left Europe on an immigrant ship and landed the day after the state was established on the first ship to enter the Jewish state. And because she was a nurse, she went directly to the front lines and was the only woman with 60 men on the bunkers in the front lines in Israel during the war. Anyhow, after I retired, I really don't believe in retirement. In fact, I'm very frustrated living here. After I retired at age 73, since as Dorothy Weiser is there, she's been active in the Jewish Agency as well, so I was selected to be head of the Russian department, and for 9 years, partially because of Bella, because I loved one Russian Israeli girl, and it meant I loved all Russian girls. I had a big staff, and when I was at the Jewish Agency, and most of the staff were new immigrants from Russia, and they claimed that I was prejudiced, that I loved all the Russian girls, which I did. But we agreed, we were sent to Russia, Bella and I, on a mission, but basically by the government of Israel, by the Mossad. You remember that after the Six-Day War, the Russian and Israel severed relationships. So Israelis couldn't get into Russia anymore, and we went as American citizens. We have dual citizenship in Israel. So we went to Russia and had a great experience. I said when we went, they didn't give us any name. In those days, they didn't have names or phone numbers. Many people, and maybe some of you, I think, have gone to Russia afterwards, but this was 1969. And when I said, how are we going to meet the Jews? So they said, with your Yiddish Apunim, my Yiddish Apunim, and Bella's facility in the Russian language, and her Western dress, don't worry, the Jews will come to you. And they came to us in the hundreds. And we brought many names and addresses back with us after several weeks in Russia. Incidentally, one of the people that we met and whose name we brought back was later named as the first ambassador to Belarus. And there was a party thrown by the foreign ministry, and I was the main speaker. They asked me to come and speak about how we had met him and brought his name back, and he came 4 years later to Israel worked with the Foreign Service of Israel. But we discovered that the Jews of Russia, because of Israel, incidentally, you remember Elie Wiesel had written a book, The Jews of Silence? After the Six-Day War, the Soviet Jews were not silent anymore. And we discovered that the very existence of the State of Israel was able to, I could use the word, to rejuvenate them. Spelling an R-E-J-E-W. We were able to establish a movement. We brought a number of missions with us, and it was very exciting for our people. And today we have over 40 congregations. I just sent my library in Jerusalem, much of my library in Jerusalem, to Moscow, because we've already established a rabbinic training program there. And we have the largest youth movement in Russia, a progressive movement. So the story of Soviet Jewry is a great story and a very moving story. And again, it shows that without Israel, and without the inspiration of the very existence of Israel, those Jews would still be silent.
Thank you very much. You've really enriched my experience, and I had that aura about you before I even have ever heard you, because I was so happy about you to give a course about Israel today. And I can't believe all the wonderful experiences that you've accomplished with Bella in your life. I'm most interested now in the movement of the Reformed Jews in Israel. I heard that you just ordained 100 women.
Not women, 100 rabbis.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Many of whom were women.
Yeah. What is the future of this movement in Israel? Is it going to be spreading? Is it going to be?
Well, we've spread. When Bella and I came in 1973, when we moved the international office, there were only 5 congregations there. And when we moved the international office, it was very symbolic. And then we joined the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency. And we became part of the Jewish world. And I think there's a great future there, but it's difficult. It's difficult because of what I talked about, the complications of the Israeli political system. And if you know, the political system is pretty bad. And Prime Minister Netanyahu now is in serious difficulty. And it looks like there may be an election sometime soon. But it's going to be hard work.
Yeah.
Hey, Ron.
It's an unusual question I have. With the bit of the lecture that you, or the sermon that you gave for Martin Luther King, there seems to have been the initiation of a friendship between the blacks and the Jews. Why didn't that ever perpetuate? Look at the way the vote at the UN was, where Africa on one side and Israel on the other side.
Well, first of all, don't mix up the situation in America in terms of the civil rights relationship and the relationship between blacks and whites in America with the situation in Europe. I don't want to get involved in this. Outside of the United States, with the African states and all that, there's not that much of a connection between the black community in America and the African states. So I don't want to get involved in that. But what you're referring to, and I think we've even talked about it, is that sometime after the March on Washington, where, as I say, Jews were instrumental. In my office, in my center, we really helped run the March on Washington. If it hadn't been for us, there wouldn't have been much participation. It wasn't very well organized, but that's another story. But then there came about a situation whereby the blacks wanted to run their own show. There was a man named Kibbe Kaplan, who was one of our closest friends, who gave us the money to purchase our building in Washington. And he was the president of the NAACP. A Jew, a white man, the last white man to be the president of the NAACP. But as the revolution proceeded, the African Americans, incidentally, in my talk there you see I use the word Negro. You can't use the word Negro anymore, but that was 50 years ago. But the African Americans, they wanted to run their own show. You couldn't, can you conceive of a white man, let alone a white Jew, a little fat prototype of a white Jew? You can't imagine a white man as president of the NAACP today, because they wanted to run their own show. And they did. Another phenomenon, unfortunately, was that blacks moved into Jewish neighborhoods. Why? Because the Jews were liberal, let them in, number one. Number two, the Jews were the slumlords and the owners of the stores. So the people who they felt were oppressing them were not only white, they were Jews. And a very complicated thing. But a person like Martin Luther King, for example, and his colleagues, I heard this morning Andrew Young, who'd been the UN ambassador, I heard him on the news this morning, and a man like that, like Martin Luther King, there was no anti-Semitism whatsoever in their efforts. It's unfortunate, but we just have to continue to work in behalf of civil rights. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.